Good evening and welcome to News Review. This week, 7 senior and influential U.S. politicians, led by North Carolina Republican Congressman George Holding, presented a motion to the House of Representatives calling for support for Gibraltar's right to self-determination. The motion recalls Gibraltar's importance as a military base during World War II and continuing use during NATO operations in the Middle East. Jonathan Sacramento asked the Chief Minister more.
Well, the motion can be debated on the floor of the House of Representatives, on the floor of the Congress, but that's very unlikely for a motion of this type. What is more likely to happen is that it will continue to accumulate support and it will find its way into the historical record of the Congress, and therefore the Congress will have de facto had this motion passed, in inverted commas, by the support it receives from those on both sides of what the Americans call the aisle. In other words, from both sides of the Congress, the Republican and the Democratic side, the two main representatives there being in those two parties. And much like an early day motion, it becomes part of the record or the history of the House of Congress.
And the full text of that motion can be found on our webpage, gbc.gi/news, on the Documents tab. In other news, following the Governor's statements on GBC's Talk About Town, the government considered that whatever the description of the Constitution order, it's the touchstone of our laws, our administration and our system of government, and must be respected by all, including those who may now think it was an overreaction and that it went too far. Mr. Picardo claims Sir James Dutton appears to be coming to understand Gibraltar and that he's been a strong advocate for the Rock and its people.
The Chief Minister says the government does not share the view that the 2006 Constitution was simply an overreaction to the Joint Sovereignty Initiative. But Fabian Picardo says it's important that Gibraltar is aware that this view is held in some quarters. He says the most objective evidence is the fact that its negotiation occurred when most, if not all, the constitutions of the other overseas territories were being negotiated. Most, he says, now include similar, if not identical, clauses and or mechanisms in many respects. This process, he adds, predated the Joint Sovereignty Initiative. The government also states it finds it impossible to share the view that the Joint Sovereignty Initiative was an emanation of ministers alone and not of Foreign Office officials. It adds the history of Gibraltar is littered with examples of different kinds of sovereignty proposals and believes these were just one more from a thick file which is clearly already in evidence. And the government says senior members of the Foreign Office have told government ministers that the Joint Sovereignty Plan had been prepared by officials, first presented to the late Foreign Secretary Robin Cook and then to his successor Jack Straw, who together with Europe Minister Peter Hain decided to advance it. Fabian Picardo says he enjoys an excellent personal relationship with the Governor, even though they may not agree on all issues. Discussions over a broad range of matters, he says, have led to the UK and Gibraltar working together in lockstep, with everyone from the Prime Minister down being very supportive of Gibraltar. Mr. Picardo says that on constitutional issues, Gibraltar's position is based on proper legal interpretation, meticulous research and sound advice, and as such, the Gibraltar view has in his time in government so far always prevailed.
And the Chief Minister told GBC he believed the Governor was only repeating what he'd been led to believe by the Foreign Office when he said the 2006 Constitution was an overreaction to the Joint Sovereignty Initiative. Fabian Picardo says it's important to note there are people in the Foreign Office and in Whitehall who believe this.
If people think that, and they say that to others, in particular to somebody who's coming out as governor, they've got it very wrong. And just look at the process of constitutional development in Gibraltar and then match it up with the process of constitutional development in all the other overseas territories, none of which went through the process of joint sovereignty. And you can see that it's a very well thought out process. It starts in the late 90s under Labour and it goes through, still under Labour, to the 2006 new constitution here and different constitutions in the Cayman Islands, all the other overseas territories, Turks and Caicos, etc. Turks and Caicos is then suspended. So there's no overreaction here. about 2002-2003 that leads to the 2006 Constitution. And if you actually look in detail at the constitutions of the other overseas territories, a lot but not all of the powers that were given to Gibraltar were also given to the other overseas territories at the same time. It's true that Gibraltar goes a little bit further, and Gibraltar now finds itself just short of Bermuda in constitutional development terms, but that is not, I think, matchable to the events of joint sovereignty.
Both the Chamber of Commerce and the Federation of Small Businesses this week expressed concern over the wording of the Bullying at Work Act, which came into effect last week. However, the Commencement Committee involved in formulating the Act and the Dignity at Work policy has described it as a landmark piece of legislation. While both organisations have stated they agree with the legislation's aim of preventing and tackling workplace bullying, they have objected to the form it's taken. The Chamber of Commerce says the new Act creates uncertainty and makes doing business in Gibraltar less attractive. It says there are inherent inequalities in the law as drafted, meaning employers could be found liable for bullying in a situation where they are neither the perpetrators or even aware it's taking place. For its part, the GFSB says the legislation is open to being abused because of its wording, adding its definition of bullying is too wide. It's concerned about the potentially crippling effect of any action against a small business. The Commencement Committee, involved in preparing the government's Dignity at Work policy and the subsequent Bullying at Work Act, has described both as positive. The committee says it's delighted with the policy, which was formulated over many months and is subject to periodical review. It's announced the creation of workshops to better prepare contact and investigating officers to help victims of abuse. The committee describes the Bullying at Work Act as a crucial piece of legislation with a deterrent factor, which affords victims of bullying a legal framework and includes protection for employers. It says the Act will place Gibraltar on par with other developed countries, adding stakeholders have had ample time to acquaint themselves with the legislation and adjust accordingly. However, the Chamber says proposals to amend the legislation made jointly with the GFSB were ignored. The GFSB says it'll be organising training sessions and providing outline policy documents relating to the Act. It's also urging any members who find themselves in difficulty as a result of the Act to get in touch. Meanwhile, the GSD opposition noted what it called the very serious but valid criticisms levelled at the Bullying at Work Act. It says it was unable to support the law when it was introduced by the government in Parliament for very similar reasons. Stephen Nish suggested to Deputy Leader Damon Borsino that his party was simply jumping on the Chamber of Commerce and GFSB's bandwagon.
Well, not at all, because in fact I'm the one that led the opposition's contribution to the debate in Parliament when we debated this bill in Parliament back in February of this year. And indeed I made, in fact, many of the points which the GFSB and the Chamber of Commerce are now making publicly, which is that of course, we are all against bullying at work and indeed bullying in whichever circumstance. But we think that this law is bad law because it doesn't address the issue in the best way possible.
And how should it have been addressed, in your opinion?
Well, I pointed out that, in fact, the legislation, this particular legislation, piece of legislation, which was introduced in the House of Commons back in 2004, was debated in the House of Commons, was described there as bad jurisprudence. And indeed, a socialist party in government at the time, the Labour Party in government of Tony Blair, felt that it would be rather a better way of dealing with this sort of blight which bullying in the workplace is on society. The better and most effective way of dealing with this would be by engaging with the business community and setting out projects, properly educating both the employers and employees and dealing with it on that basis. That is more effective than introducing legislation which in many respects is simply difficult to enforce. If a small business is subjected to an unmeritorious claim from an employee, let's say it's unmeritorious, that employer will need to defend its position, adds huge considerable cost to it, and because it's in the industrial tribunal, it will be dealt with and determined in the industrial tribunal, it will be very difficult to recover those costs. That could mean the end of the business. So that is one area which which for us gave us very serious cause for concern, and that is why we were unable to support the bill and abstained from it. It so happens that both the GFSB and the Chamber of Commerce have now come out publicly sharing our view in relation to this.
And the government said the GSD's criticism ignored the reality of the work done in this field by the GSLP Liberals. It said it's misleading for Mr. Bosino to have suggested that the government had failed to consult on this act. In other news this week, lawyers working on criminal cases can now claim substantially increased legal aid fees following the publication of new rules. The rates had remained unchanged for many years. The new rates will apply in respect of all exceptionally complex cases and not just those involving fraud as hitherto. Additionally, Queen's Counsel from abroad will be paid at the same rate as local QCs, which wasn't the case until this week. Stephen Nish spoke to Justice Minister Gilbert Likudi and asked him whether the changes had been introduced as a result of criticisms that higher legal aid fees were only payable in exceptionally difficult and complex fraud cases.
Not at all. It's a manifesto commitment that we had to revise both legal aid and legal assistance. This is the first stage of that process. I announced in the budget in May this year that we intended to publish the new rates for legal aid before the start of the new legal year, which starts in October, and that's why we are doing this now. It has been a long process, a process of consultation with the Bar Council, with the Chief Justice, with the Registrar who administers the scheme. These rules are fully agreed with the Bar Council. Both the rules and the schedule which sets the rates are fully agreed with the Bar Council, and I'm very, very happy that we, after so many years of having a scheme in place with rates which really did not provide reasonable remuneration for lawyers involved in criminal cases, we now have rates agreed with the Bar Council which we believe will provide that reasonable remuneration.
Meanwhile, the opposition expressed disappointment with the government's legal aid reform, claiming no changes have been made that benefit the users who need it most, those on modest incomes to whom legal assistance isn't available. The opposition this week revealed it had written to all local football clubs outlining its vision for a new national football stadium. This consisted of upgrading Victoria Stadium initially to a UEFA Category 3 stadium and eventually a Category 4. The GSD is not in favour of siting the new stadium at Europa Point, as the GFA and the government advocate. But it emphasises that it entirely supports and encourages the ambition to play UEFA international football in Gibraltar.
Well, no, look, we've been very consistent throughout in relation to our opposition to the Europa Point, which of course has the propensity of being very unpopular with the football fraternity. But we are prepared to take unpopular decisions if we think that it's in the best interest of this community. That's what politics is about. But politics is also about offering alternatives. And throughout all this, Stephen, we've tried to offer alternatives. And our alternative to a football stadium at Europa Point is Victoria Stadium. And there are three separate phases to this. The first is to try and bring the national football team to play its international UEFA games here in Gibraltar. And that can be done relatively easily by just simply upgrading Victoria Stadium to a Cat 3. At the moment, it's just short of a Cat 3 status. And that's in the interest of football, and it's also in the interest of grassroots football, because it will generate interest in the national team if more people can go and watch them. And also, of course, it's in the interest of the supporters who at the moment have got to travel to Portugal and may have to travel to the United Kingdom. But separate from that is the upgrading of Victoria Stadium to a Category 4 stadium.
And we'll be back with more of this week's stories after the break.